Welcome back. I'm Jesse Baines with Yahoo Finance Canada. You're watching Editor's Edition, and today we're talking real estate with Realosophy Realty's John Pasalis. He's in Toronto. Thanks for being here, John.
Thanks for having me.
And in Vancouver, we have Oakland Realty's Steve Saretsky. Thanks for being here, Steve.
Let's do this. Looking forward to it.
Okay, so let's start with, we're going to talk about a lot of things today. We're going to get to your questions. We're going to talk about this debate raging about supply and demand, even a potential 20% correction potential. So stay with us for for more on that. But let's start with the big news that happened just after we recorded our last episode. This is our first opportunity to talk about it, which is the Bank of Canada surprising the market odds, by not hiking its overnight rate. Steve, let's start with you. Was that a surprise, A, and B, did that give buyers and investors something of a green light to really get going and get into the market?
I mean, I don't know if it was a surprise on my end. I mean, I think it certainly was from the market perspective, because I think they had every excuse to raise, in January. It was basically already priced in by the market. So, I mean, I don't know if I necessarily call it a policy mistake, but I think that they probably should have moved given the strength in the housing market, given that you've got inflation at 30-year highs. I think they kind of kept up. I think it just extended the housing party a little bit longer, right? I mean, as we've talked about, I think in the previous show, like it does take some time for these interest rates to sort of filter through into the housing market, right? I mean, if the Bank of Canada raises rates, let's say 25 basis points here coming up in March, the time that starts to filter through into variable rate mortgages, like most buyers have pre-approvals for 90 days, right? So they won't be subject to these higher interest rates really until those pre-approval rate holds expire. And so I don't really see these higher interest rates filtering through into the housing market in terms of like slowing demand and actually taking a bite out of the market, probably until the later bit of this year, probably towards Q4.
John, in the GTA, did you find that any difference after that announcement in terms of buyers feeling like they want to get in now before prices go up? Did that affect the timing or any sort of psychology did you find?
I mean, I think it didn't change it that much because we're still in a very competitive market. I mean, I think what it did is it's just like extending this rally in some ways. Just keeping rates low. But I mean, I do agree with Steve. I mean, even if they had raised 25 basis points, it would not have had a big impact. I mean, you need to see multiple hikes to kind of cool demand. And I agree with Steve as well. Like we might not see kind of rates having an impact on the market till the second half of the year.
Okay, and after that announcement, we heard from the Bank of Canada during a news conference. Let's have a listen to the new Deputy Governor, Carolyn Rodgers, not to be confused with Carolyn Wilkins. You might remember her from her OSFI days. She was actually one of the architects of the mortgage stress test back in 2018. But here's what she had to say about what the Bank of Canada thinks about the current state of the housing market and going forward. Have a listen.
For a while now in Canada, and housing affordability has been a persistent problem. You can attribute it to a number of things. Certainly low interest rates is one of those factors. A recent spike up in prices has also brought investors into the market, more investors into the market. That's something the bank has published research on recently. Overall, the bank's view is that the most important thing that will restore balance to the housing market in Canada is an increase in supply. Supply has not kept pace with demand, and we think that's an important thing that needs to happen. So we're encouraged by recent conversations in that direction. But overall, coming back to the forecast, we think housing activity will stay elevated for a while. Certainly, our message today that more interest rates are on a rising path will feed through to mortgage rates and likely moderate demand over time.
Okay, over time, it doesn't seem like there's any urgency to rein the party in. Steve, she acknowledged that low rates are behind the demand in part, but the whole supply thing came up again. The real estate boards are beating that drum constantly. What's your assessment of her assessment?
I mean, I don't think anybody really wants to take responsibility. Obviously, I'm a huge believer in low rates and borrowing have really been driving this housing market, particularly over the last 18 to 24 months throughout the pandemic. And I don't know. I think if you look at policymakers, I think what's more important for the listeners to take away is like the policy discussion this time around compared to say 2016, 15, 16, 17, when we had the last really big bull market in housing. I think that what we're seeing this time around is that policymakers aren't really talking or focusing on the demand side. They're not talking really so much about taxes and changes to the mortgage stress tests and stuff like that. Where you're seeing all the conversation is around the supply side. So we have Ms. Rodgers here talking about the housing supply. You've had OSFI more recently coming out and did a full podcast just talking about housing supply. And I mean, I can speak even here, politically, the BC government run by the NDP, which was able to get into government based on targeting demand side policies in the housing market, bring in increasing the foreign buyers taxes, speculation taxes, and things like that. Even they now are only talking about housing supply. So I think it's just an interesting policy shift that we're no longer really talking about demand side. We're just strictly focused on the supply side now.
And just thinking back, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but in was it 2017, 2018, when the stress test was brought in, at least momentarily, we saw a pause. We did see declines, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was people sort of front running the stress test when it was beefed up in 2017. That was then we got like this kind of blow off top, and then after that, we just kind of exhausted. We had not only the B20 stress test start to bite, but you also had higher mortgage rates started to slow the housing market, and we've talked about it before. But again, in Vancouver in 2018, we had a 20-year low in home sales that year, and I think the GTA was a 10-year low. So I think that those demand side policies, which was higher mortgage rates and a stress test that had some teeth, certainly took a bite out of the housing market back then. And we're back off to the races today. So I think that the policy discussion seems to be strictly focused around supply this time around. So again, right or wrong, I think it's just an important signal for market participants to take away.
Mm-hmm. And back then, Steve, during that period, that last that I don't want to call it, I guess it was a bull run in 2017 or whatever it was I mean, now all we hear is the markets are so tight. There's supply is so low, record lows. What was supply back then, if you could just refresh the viewer's memory?
I mean, supply was tight in 2017. That was why we had huge price growth. But then, in 2018, like I said, as rates started to increase, the mortgage stress test really was taking effect into the market, where you could see credit demand, right? Like residential mortgage credit growth, I think fell to like decade lows. Of course, inventory started to build, and then we actually had, quite high inventory, which obviously we saw some declines in prices as well. I mean, I would argue that in greater Vancouver area in 2018, I would say prices softened about 10%.
Okay. John, what's your take on the Bank of Canada's take?
I mean, it's an odd message. I mean, a few months ago, they were talking about how they were worried that extrapolative expectations were driving the housing market, and that's just a fancy way of saying this irrational exuberance where people will thinking that prices will keep going up forever. And now we have the bank basically saying that prices will keep going up forever. I mean, at least they don't quite say like that. They say there won't be any balance to the market until there's more supply, which is another way of saying prices are going to keep going up until we have more supply. So they're actually in many ways fueling this exuberance, this fear of missing out that buyers have, that are leading a lot of buyers to pay 50% more than what similar homes sold for a year ago in these small towns in Ontario. So, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, yes, Canada needs to build more housing, but when economists and policymakers are trying to rationalize 40 and 50% price growth by simply saying it's a supply problem, I think is a bit misleading. And I think it's potentially like setting up some of these young families, I think potentially for a really kind of risky financial situation in the future if prices fall in some of those small markets.
Mm-hmm. I do want to get
John,
into the supply thing a little. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, yeah, sorry, John. I mean, you and I have talked about it, like, off the show here. But like, I think like if you get mortgage rates back to, let's say, 4%, which seems not possible, I think you'll see a lot more housing supply on the market, and that sort of narrative around low supply will suddenly disappear. But anyways.
100%.
John, let's talk about the Ontario market, or the GTA market. We keep hearing about the the suburbs, and this was a big thing when work from home first started, but it seems to be reigniting. Is this just like the second coming of the work from home story? What's going on when you look at the city of Toronto versus the outer areas of the Greater Toronto area?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting. I think about a year and a half ago, certainly in 2020, at the start of the pandemic, I think the boom to these outskirts was definitely driven by this desire to work from home, this desire to have more space. I mean, people were locked down for only a couple months, but that was enough to kind of get people out of the city. But since then, the demand in these small towns is largely driven by this needs to drive as far as you can to qualify to buy a home. Like the average price for a low rise, and that by low rise I mean like row house, semi and detached home in the GTA in January hit 1.65 million, I think, which is ridiculous. I mean, who can afford a $1.65 million home? You basically can't buy a family home pretty much for under $1 million. So that's obviously a lot of money for a lot of people. So it's pushing people an hour and a half outside of Toronto because that's the only place that they could afford to buy a home. And it's leading to this explosive growth in house prices.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a perfect segue into a little game we're going to play. It's called Nuts or Not Nuts. So I'm going to show you guys, I'm going to start with John in the Ontario area. If you can just tell me if it's nuts or not nuts, and in one sentence, why or why not. So let's get rolling. We got some, Ben Rabbit, you put this together in one neat package, but we've been seeing a lot of these. So we have, Craig says, this house was sold for 1.175 last night. It was bought for 349,000 in 2015. It's a 3-bedroom with an unfinished basement in Curtis, Ontario. For Christ's sake, he says. But John, nuts or not nuts?
I mean, those are getting pretty nuts prices in markets like Curtis, Ontario, for sure.
Okay, next we have R.E. Woman, Michelle. Michelle says, what on earth is going on? I'm speechless. And she's been sharing a lot of these. Probably because I'm choking on my business card. Laugh out loud. No comments necessary. So this appears to be a row house, townhouse. Is this, what's the right word, John? Row house, townhouse?
This is a row house or townhouse. Yeah, same thing, exactly.
Same thing? Okay.
Yeah.
So listed for $699,000, sold for what? $1,171,900. I don't know if the 900 at the end really matters at this point, but in good old Oshawa. John, nuts or not nuts?
You know, it's really unbelievable what's happening in markets like Durham region, and that's where Oshawa is. Because if you roll back the clock back to like the beginning of the pandemic, the average price for a low-rise house in Durham was about 650,000. That's the average, right? And it has doubled in like a year. And you're, 1.2 million for a row house in Oshawa. And Oshawa is the most affordable market in Durham. It's the furthest east. So it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable the prices that we're seeing in some of these markets. So yeah, I'll put it in the nuts category. I mean, I don't mean to offend or upset people, but it's just, you throw up your hands and you think, oh my God, it's crazy for everyone who's bidding because they feel like they just have to pay these prices to get into the market. So it's unbelievable for sure.
I think the fine folks of Oshawa have developed a pretty thick skin over the years. So let's move on to the next one in our game of nuts or not nuts. Peter Kyriazopoulos, I probably butchered his last name, but maybe John, you can correct me. How do you say that?
Kyriazopoulos.
Kyriazopoulos. Okay, there we go. Okay, not bad, right? So So we have 900 sold for 980,000 back in October 2020, way back in October 2020, and now sold in November 2021. We're not even getting into the 2022 madness yet. Sold for 1.5 million. Another hub, another mecca, if you will, Stouffville, Ontario. Whitchurch, Stouffville. John,
Yeah.
nuts or not nuts?
I mean, listen, this price growth is crazy. It's hard to rationalize, but at the end of the day, it's a detached house in Stouffville. You know what I mean? Like, if you consider the last house was 1.2 for a row house in Oshawa, you got to look at relative differences. I'm not trying to justify 50% price growth. I think it's still nuts, but at the end of the day, it's hard to get a detached house for 1.5 in the GTA. So I mean,
Yeah.
still
last
crazy,
one.
still crazy. Go.
So that's okay. I have a feeling I know where this is going to go. I think we're going to go.
They're all
10 for
all
10
nuts.
on
We're giving up.
Okay, here's Chris Sanderson, a shed. I feel bad for the people that purchased this house and somebody's calling it a shed, but anyhow, a shed in Guelph. This is Chris Sanderson's words, not ours. Doubled in under 2 years. 444,000, which seems downright cheap in today's market. Sold for 927,000, and might I say, still seems cheap, relatively speaking, based on some of the prices we're seeing. But am I crazy, John? Is this still nuts?
I'm throwing up the white flag. I'm giving up. I can't. There's nothing else.
Okay.
This is. I mean, what do you say? Like almost $1 million in Guelph. I mean, I don't even know what to say.
Okay. Let's go to the other side of the country now with Steve. Let's look at BC. So here's the first one. This is from Mortimer. Check out Mortimer on Twitter. He or she, it's an alias, posts all kinds of nutty prices. So we have, this is in Vancouver. So we'll start with Vancouver. 31% in 4 months. Just sold for $2 million. It originally sold in March for $1 million and change. So this is 31% in 4 months. What do you think of this, Steve? Nuts or not nuts?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely nuts. I mean, this is looks like this is in Vancouver here, so that's probably not the worst of it. But yeah, I mean, that's in the last 3 months in particular, you've seen like an exponential growth, like a hockey stick type of growth in a lot of these markets. So it's been unbelievable. Nuts.
Okay. Nuts. Okay, next, what do we have? This is also from Mortimer, but now we're leaving Vancouver. We're in Maple Ridge, BC. Okay, this one's a doozy. So 48% in 3 months, nothing done. And, they're clear, house is no value. That's the actual house. So this increased 48% in 3 months, and the house has no value, just the land. Maple Ridge, BC. Steve, nuts or not nuts?
Jesse, this is just transitory, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's.
I thought we're not allowed to use that anymore. That word's been abandoned. Okay.
Steve's a comedian.
Unacceptable. Maple Ridge is, for anyone that's watching that doesn't know where it is, Maple Ridge, I was literally out there the other day. It's a 55-minute drive, to be precise, from the city core. So it's a long ways out.
Famous, isn't that the home of Paul Tracy, Maple Ridge's IndyCar driver, famous race car driver back in the day, Paul Tracy? That's what I know Maple Ridge for.
Maybe that's why the prices are going up.
Yeah, the Paul Tracy effect kicks in 20 years later. Okay, let's move on to the next one. We have, again, Mortimer. 44% in 5 months. This is in Coquitlam. Sold for 1.9 and change. August was 1.3, 44%. What do you think of this one, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, this is just like unbelievable. The fact that like nothing was done. It's like I said, it's been escape velocity. I think the problem is like we're trying to this is nuts first off, but it's tough because I think like the Bank of Canada, for example, and policymakers, they're looking at like these Terranet home price indexes or, the indexes that the real estate boards put out. And like, those just tend to be lagging indicators. And so like, it's not going to show up in like your official quote unquote data, but I mean, feet on the ground, I would say just in the last 4 to 6 weeks, detached prices are up 10%. And a lot of the market's up 10% in the last 4 to 6 weeks. And like, again, that's not going to show up in like your official data, but as you can clearly see with some of these examples, the pace of price inflation or acceleration has been unbelievable. I think we're getting very, very close to the blow off top and perhaps some market exhaustion, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, I think we're going to end this game here. I think we know how this movie is going to end. So let's just move on to other matters at hand. Starting with Ontario's Housing Task Force. So this is coming back to that whole supply issue. So the findings were, we need to make 1.5 million homes in 10 years. We want more density. We need to get rid of NIMBYism, red tape, less scope to appeal projects, less time spent consulting with the public. John, do you think this is at least a step in the right direction? It is a long time, 10 years, but
yeah,
what do you think?
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, I mean, 100%. It's a step in the right direction. I mean, there are definitely too many barriers in terms of what people can build where. I mean, they're right. We need to build and allow more density in existing neighborhoods. I mean, the fact is, I mean, I think where I disagree with some of these things. Like at the end of the day, these are important policies that might impact our housing market and should over the longer term. I mean, it's going to take some time for some of these policies to put in place, assuming they even are. Again, these are just recommendations. But listen, at the end of the day, I think there are important policies, and there definitely are a step forward for new housing construction.
Okay. I want to talk about the head of OSFI, Peter Rutledge, making a lot of waves. It sort of harkens back to the CMHC days of calling for up to 20% correction at the start of the pandemic. But so basically, Peter was on the Hurley Burley podcast and said once rates start rising, and I'm paraphrasing here, that buyer sentiment will sort of crack, and we'll see a slowdown in prices. You could see as much as 10 to 20% in some markets. I know psychology plays a big part, but what do you think of those comments, Steve?
I mean, I listened to the whole podcast. I think Peter's a pretty smart guy. I mean, I know people might give him a tough time, but he made some pretty interesting comments. I mean, the problem is 10 to 20%. I mean, I think that's a high probability event in my honest opinion, at least in parts of the suburbs where you've seen, basically, as we just showed, all these nuts things happening. But 10 to 20% basically brings you back to like September prices, September 2021, which again, I don't think even if you get 20%, I mean, we're still extremely far from quote unquote affordability. So I think that these housing challenges are going to be here for the foreseeable future, regardless if you get that 10 to 20% pullback, which people I think are desperate for at this point.
Mm-hmm. I'd be interested to hear your take, John. What sort of went through your head when you heard that?
No, I mean, I agree with Steve. I mean, this 10 to 20% price decline is definitely a high probability event, especially in some of these outer areas. I don't want to say I don't think. I'd be surprised if that happens this year, quite frankly. Like, I think there's still too much momentum in the market. Rates are still low. Like we said at the top of the call, like the effect of higher rates and all of these other things might not be felt till the end of this year. So you might see some pullback next year. But it's hard to predict when, again, the psychology of the market changes. So, at the end of the day, like Steve said, in the GTA, prices went up literally almost 10% in 4 to 6 weeks. So, trying to predict when things are going to slow down is tough. But I still think there's a bit of momentum in the market still.
Mm-hmm. And if this is any evidence, a recent Bloomberg analyst poll found 64% of the people polled expect real estate in their neighborhoods to rise over the next 6 months. And this was taken after the Bank of Canada announcement. So, if this is any indication, and this is up 60% from the previous week. So up from 60% the previous week. It was one of the fastest 7-day increases, apparently. So clearly, if this is any indication, buyer psychology is still like, we expect prices to go up. So that something bigger needs to happen, I suppose. John, I want to ask you, and I saw you put together a really great thread on Twitter about about the psychology of buyers and how some say it's irrational, but it isn't in their minds. So can you tell us a little bit about buyer psychology right now? Like, we saw those things that you guys called them nuts and we joked, but what's going through buyers' heads right now when they bid the way they are?
Yeah, I know. I think it's an important question, man, because we just had our game where we look at these prices and we think this is nuts. You know what I mean? Like, all of us are like, this is crazy. This is a really rapid growth. But at the end of the day, we have to think about, those are real people paying those prices. And at the end of the day, they're paying them because they feel like they have to. For 2 years, they've been told prices are as high as they are because we're not building enough homes. And prices are going to keep rising because we're not building enough homes. So if those are the two narratives that you believe and that our governments are telling you, OSFI's telling you, Bank of Canada's telling you, bank economists are telling you, well, you have to pay 1.2 for a row house in Oshawa because you feel like if you don't, you're never going to be able to afford a home. So I think these are 100%, when if prices fall in the future, economists might look back and say, oh, these people are irrational. They're paying 40-50% more than what homes sold for a year ago. But that's easy to say after the fact. In the moment today, people are doing that, quite frankly, because the government and economists are telling them that's what they should be doing to get into the housing market.
And John, you are putting together a workshop for people that are trying to negotiate this, this 50 bid competitions that they find themselves in. It's we only have half an hour here. We're already not going to get to questions, but how can people sign up and take in some of that knowledge to help them through this?
Yeah, it's off our website, movesmartly.com/bootcamp. It's basically like an online course, 4 weeks with on-demand videos, and I'm going to doing like a weekly Q&A. And really I put it together because it's such a stressful time in the market. I think people have a lot of questions. People are very anxious. People are trying to understand when should they hit pause, when should they buy. So it's really kind of trying to answer a lot of those types of questions.
Okay, and Steve, if you had some advice for people that are finding themselves in this situation, with compressing a course like that into a sentence or two, what would be the big thing that you would, a big piece of advice that you would give buyers that are looking for a home that find themselves bidding against 40, 50 people at a time?
I think that you really have to try to avoid the bidding wars, which is like, well, there's bidding.
But are they avoidable? Like, can you buy a house in your neck of the woods without entering a bidding war? Is that even possible?
Okay, so somewhat. I mean, the point being is that you have to avoid the houses that everybody else wants. What does everybody else want? They want move-in ready, looks really nice in the pictures. Oh, it's priced extremely attractive. It looks like I can afford it. And then they show up and it's like you got 100 groups through. It was underpriced by $150,000, $200,000. They get 20 offers. And obviously if you're having to beat, 19 other bidders for the house, you're going to pay an excessive price. It is what it is. So typically speaking, if I can, I try to encourage and push my clients and to say, you know what, let's look for the one that doesn't have very good marketing. The realtor took, photos on his old 1990s flip phone and hey, yeah, it's got some shag carpets. You're gonna have to put $50,000 into renovating the home, but that's how you dwindle down your buyer pool. And I think you get much better value in today's market. Because again, if you target these move-in ready homes that are nicely staged, that show extremely well, you're gonna pay a hefty premium.
Right. Okay, good advice. Look for a diamond in the rough. Steve, you also are a busy guy. You have the Soretsky Report and a show for anybody that's interested in policy and central bank and banking and macroeconomics. Tell us about the Soretsky Report, how our viewers can access that as well as your show.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate it. I know we're doing the free plugs today, but the Soretsky Report is basically a monthly 10, 15 page report, really like a deep dive analysis kind of on the Vancouver housing market, everything that I think you pretty much need to know. Totally free on my website, stevesoretsky.com. I pump one of those out every single month, kind of recapping the housing market. So it's definitely a pretty good resource, I think, for those interested.
And the Looney Hour.
The Looney Hour is a macro podcast with a couple other co-hosts, and we just chat about Canadian economics and macro, and then I've got my personal show, which is once a week on Saturdays, where we talk mostly about Canadian housing. So if you want to check that out, it's just on YouTube. You can just YouTube my name.
Excellent. Okay. And meanwhile, be sure to check out both John and Steve on Twitter. They share all kinds of valuable insights to help you navigate these markets. And also be sure to check Yahoo Finance Canada. We have stories on all your stories on real estate, stocks, cryptocurrencies, energy markets, you name it. We will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Apologies to everybody sent in their questions. We got carried away. Next time, I promise we'll get to them. Thank you. See you next time.